Okay, I screwed up. I did this whole part of the chapter on the fish and then realized that when I hit the little button, it had never actually started recording. So I have some stuff already written down on the overhead. So it's gonna be kind of like a PowerPoint. But this chapter, we're looking at the vertebrates. We're gonna split them up into their subgroups. Now the fish actually are 3 different groups within the vertebrates. So we're gonna cover them all together. This is not a cladogram. It's supposed to show ancestry, and the width of these is supposed to show the number of species. Really, when you go back here, it's just the species you can pick up from the fossil record. And here's your lampreys and your hagfish. Slime eels are also known as hagfish. And your cartilage fish, your bony fish, different levels of bony fish. These connections are very changeable now I did work on fish parasites, so I really wasn't a fish person, but I was kind of fish adjacent. And the connections between these different fish groups seem to shift all over the place depending on what the last textbook was that came out. These guys are kind of interesting, the coelacanths, in that they were thought to be extinct, is that they were in the fossil record and then they weren't. Well, apparently what happened was their ancestors that lived close enough to the coasts to wind up in the sediments that we could find millions of years later as fossils, they went away. But their relatives that lived in deeper water continued. And so, as far as the paleontologists were concerned, they were extinct, couldn't find any fossils, and nobody knew that they still existed until somebody literally ran across one in a fish market for sale, like in the 1920s or 1930s, and went, well, that thing's supposed to be extinct. Since then, they found there's a few species living right off the edge of the continental shelf in Africa and parts of Asia, a couple of different species. So it's one of those things they call a living fossil, because it looks quite a bit like what you find in the fossil record. So we're going to split the fish into their 3 groups. The jawless fish, Agnatha, kind of means no jaw. The hagfish, also known as slime eels, I kind of prefer that. That's a cooler name. The lampreys, also known as lamprey eels. Eels are kind of like bugs. Remember I said that there's a group within the insects that are technically the bugs, but everybody calls the rest of them bugs anyway. A snaky fish, there is a group within the bony fish that are technically the eels, but any long snaky fish is typically called an eel, so not technically an eel, but it's what everybody calls it. So these are the cartilage fish, Chondrichthyes, which looks really fancy till you realize it's Latin for cartilage fish, literally, that's what it's. And it includes the sharks, the rays, and the skates. The differences between rays and skates are, again, really technical. And then you got the bony fish, which I'll put up later. At one point, there were probably lots and lots and lots and lots of jawless fish. Cartilage-based skeletons, they're not considered cartilage fish because they don't really have much of a skeleton. They don't have much of a backbone. They don't have jaws. But their pieces are easily broken down in nature. So both the jawless fish and the cartilage fish don't show up great in the fossil record. We know about ancient sharks mostly because their teeth are very hard and very calcified, and they lose them all the time. So they wind up in the fossil record a lot. In fact, give me a second. I want to show you something. This is a shark jaw, and I think you see there. You see, it's not just one row of teeth, it's a bunch of teeth, almost on a little Rolodex. And they're forever losing teeth, and then the one behind it fills in place, and then another one grows out of the jaw. So the fossil record is full of shark teeth, because these things are much harder. This feels more like a solid plastic than a bone. Kind of looks like a bone, and it has a certain amount of calcification for it, because if you're gonna root your teeth in something, you want it to be fairly solid. But for the most part, cartilage fish don't show up well in the fossil record. The jawless fish, these two guys are the only ones still alive. The slime eels, also known as the hagfish, are scavengers in the oceans. They have a very good survival method. If you try to eat them, they will fill your mouth with this nasty, huge volume of slippery, gunky slime. And makes them hard to, for a long time they were considered a nuisance fish. If you picked them up accidentally, they would sometimes smother the fish caught with them. And then once you had them dumped on the deck, you couldn't pick them up because it's too slimy. And you'd have to kind of kick them across the deck and kick them back into the ocean. But I guess because we're gradually running out of the fish that we've normally catch and eat, people are now starting to eat more slime eels in some parts of the world. Lampreys are a pest in the Great Lakes. They're an invasive species. They're a parasite. That's actually unusual in chordates, to have a parasite that is a little animal that lives off of a big animal. We have other weirder types of parasites I may talk about when we get to the birds. The lampreys, again, they have this, their front end is kind of a disc, and they have teeth, but the teeth, they don't have jaws. This disc just has a whole bunch of circles of teeth in it, and they almost attach to larger animals with it, almost like a suction cup. And then they just kind of rasp away with those teeth and eat what scrapes off. Sometimes they can scrape their way in and actually rasp their way around the inside of a large fish. If you go swimming in Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, you may come out of the water with these things attached to you, because they're not that discriminating, and they will attach to people, and they're not that easy to get off. As I watched a River Monsters, I think it was a River Monsters. It was the same guy who did River Monsters, and he got one of them attached to his throat and had a heck of a time. He'd pull on it, and it was just stretching his skin out. Fun little critters. They reproduce in quick flowing fresh water, and because they're a very primitive type of chordate, some of their chemistry is different than regular fish. And so there are places like NCON will put little drip buckets above the few streams these guys can breed in that will try to poison the larvae before they leave the streams and go out where the big fish are. Cartilage fish, the cartilage skeleton is, like I said, it's a little flexible. It doesn't have the same sort of power as a bony skeleton, but it's not as heavy as a bony skeleton either. These guys tend to be heavier than the water that they're in. They live on the bottom, that's not really that big a deal, but once they're up and swimming, part of their swimming activity has to keep themselves from sinking. If they live in the open water where the bottom is a mile below them, then they have to swim all the time in order to keep themselves from sinking out of sight. And sometimes you'll hear people go, oh yeah, those sharks, they have to keep swimming or they can't breathe. There's something wrong with them. Well, no, if you gotta swim all the time, then that forces water through your gills. You don't need to build gill pumps like other fish that sit in one place need to pump water through their gills. So it's more just an adaptation of the trade-off that gotta keep swimming. Bony fish have bony bones, duh. If you've ever cleaned them, you know they've got bony bones. But they also have, if you've cleaned a fish, you've run into this kind of shiny, gas-filled object. It's called a swim bladder. So if you're a fish and you're underwater, the deeper you go, the denser the water is around you, because it's got all this water on top that's squishing it. And if you're heavier than the water, you're going to sink. And that's what the cartilage fish do. They sink. If all you need is for your average density to match the water around you, and you don't have to work to stay at that level. You can just kind of hang there. It saves a lot of energy. And that's what the swim bladder does. It's an adjustable balloon with sometimes gases that they get off of the surface out of the air. A lot of times they fill it with nitrogen gas. There's a system in them that can do that. And they can adjust the amount of gas in the swim bladder to match the water around them. So whatever depth they're at, they can just hang there. They swim, they don't sink. If they do have to sink, they have to adjust the swim bladder. If they come up, they have to adjust the swim bladder. If you catch fish at a great distance and you pull them up too fast, they can explode because they can't adjust the swim bladder fast enough. You know, they were down there fighting a lot of density. They are by far the most speciesific group of vertebrates or chordates. Way more species of bony fish than of any of the other groups. Bony fish evolved in fresh water. And so they're largely waterproof, right? You live in fresh water, you gotta worry about water flooding into your cells. There's always more water coming in than going out. You can't match fresh water for dilution levels. So most of their surfaces are waterproof. They got a little bit more dilute as they evolved in fresh water, but you can never be as dilute as fresh water. And even the ones that have gone back into the ocean, or the ones that came onto land like us, we're a little bit more dilute than ocean water, but we're pretty close to ocean water, which isn't the same thing as density. Dilution is water, you know, what's your water mix? You know, how much water do you have mixed with other stuff? Things that live in the ocean have lived in the ocean for a very long time. They match the dilution of the water around them. So water can go in and out and in and out. It doesn't have any net flow in that would swell the cells up. It doesn't have any net flow out that would lose water to the surroundings. It's just kind of even, because that's made sense to work your chemistry out that way when you evolved in ocean water. Once you're in fresh water, can't do that anymore. But that kept the echinoderms out of fresh water. It sort of kept the cartilage fish. Cartilage fish have not done well in fresh water. And the cephalopods, the octopus and the squid, really have never gotten into fresh water. So it's sometimes been a good thing. Okay, we're splitting this chapter up to the vertebrates. These are actually subgroups within the vertebrates. They're all considered fish, but they're separate subgroups of the fish. They're separate superclasses, if I'm remembering correctly. All depends on the book you pick up, really. Remember, the names are recognizable, but the levels can change. Okay, that's it for that part of chapter 10.